In 1971, a Swedish biologist named Lars Wilsson took a group of beaver kits away from their parents on the day they were born. He raised them in concrete tanks. No mud, no running water, no adult beavers to copy. These animals lived their entire early lives in a world with nothing to build and nobody to teach them. Then one day, Wilson turned on a tap. Within minutes, the beavers started piling up sticks, mud, and stones, dragging them across the floor and trying to dam the trickle of water flowing across the concrete. Nobody had ever shown them what a dam was. They had never even seen one. So how did they know exactly what to do? For most of the 20th century, biologists drew a firm line between two kinds of animal behavior. On one side, there was learned behavior, the kind you pick up from your parents or your environment, like a young chimpanzee watching its mother use a stick to fish termites out of a mound. Copying her grip, copying her angle, slowly getting better with practice. On the other side, there was instinct, the kind you are simply born with, like a newborn sea turtle crawling out of its sandy nest in the dark, and somehow turning toward the ocean without ever being told which direction the water lies. No parent, no teacher, no demonstration, just a behavior that was already loaded into the animal the day it hatched. Most behaviors in the wild sat somewhere in the murky space between those two extremes. A songbird, for example, is born with a rough template of its species' song, but it still has to hear adult birds singing in the trees around it to fill in the finer melody. A wolf knows how to hunt, but it gets faster, smarter, and more coordinated by running with the pack. The line between learned and instinct was always a little blurry, and biologists had spent decades arguing over which animals sat on which side of it. Beavers were one of the great unsolved cases. Their dams are enormous, complex, multi-layered structures of branches, mud, and stones, sometimes engineered with separate spillway channels to handle floodwater. Nobody could quite agree on whether young beavers built these by copying the adults around them, or whether the entire blueprint was somehow already inside their heads from birth. That is what Lars Wilsson decided to find out. Lars Wilsson was a Swedish biologist working out of the University of Stockholm in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He had spent years studying European beavers in their natural habitat across the cold rivers and forests of Scandinavia. And like many researchers of his era, he was obsessed with one specific question: how much of what a beaver does is taught, and how much is built into the animal before it ever opens its eyes? To answer that, he designed an experiment so clean it almost feels cruel. He took beaver kits away from their parents within days of birth. These were animals that had never seen a dam, never seen running water, never seen another beaver gnawing on a tree, never seen anything that looked even vaguely like the wild environment a normal beaver grows up in. He raised them by hand in dry concrete enclosures lined with smooth walls and solid floors. There were no streams, there were no logs, there was nothing for a beaver to chew on, dam up, or dig into. The animals grew up in what was essentially a beaver-shaped void of experience. For months, Wilson watched them eat, sleep, and groom themselves. They behaved like normal beavers in every way that did not involve construction. They simply had no construction to do because there was no water and no material. Then, when the beavers were old enough, he ran the test. He took one of his hand-reared, isolation-raised beavers, placed it in a new room, and turned on a tap. A thin stream of water began running across the smooth concrete floor. He stepped back, set up his cameras, and waited to see what an animal who had never been taught anything about water would do. The beaver hesitated for only a few seconds. Then it walked over to the thin trickle of water, lowered its head, and listened. Wilson described this listening behavior in his published notes as one of the most striking moments of the whole experiment. The animal seemed to be locating the exact spot where the sound of running water was loudest, the place where the flow was strongest. And then it started building. The beaver began grabbing whatever loose material Wilson had placed in the enclosure, small sticks, pieces of bark, scraps of cardboard, anything it could carry. It dragged each piece across the concrete and dropped it directly across the path of the running water. Not somewhere nearby, not in a random spot, across the flow. It packed mud and damp shavings into the gaps between the sticks, exactly the way wild beavers seal the leaks in a real dam. It worked at the spot where the water was loudest, the same spot where any wild beaver would instinctively know to start construction. Within a short time, there was a small, lumpy, but unmistakably real beaver dam sitting on the floor of a Swedish laboratory, built by an animal that had never seen another beaver build anything, built by an animal that had never seen a river, built by an animal that, by every measure of a learned behavior, should not have known what a dam was, what it was for, or how to make one. Wilson ran the experiment again, with another isolation-raised beaver. The result was the same. He ran it again, and again. The animals always reacted to running water by trying to block it. They always carried materials in the same kind of awkward, two-pawed waddle. They always packed the gaps with mud. The behavior was not a fluke. It was not learned. It was waiting inside them. For decades, biologists treated this kind of result as an oddity, a curious case study. Beavers were just unusually programmed animals, and that was that. But in 1982, the British evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The Extended Phenotype, and it changed the way scientists thought about what genes can actually do. Dawkins argued that a gene does not just shape the body of the animal that carries it. A gene can also shape the things that animal builds, the burrows it digs, the webs it spins, the dams it constructs. A beaver dam, in this view, is not separate from beaver biology. It is part of beaver biology, the same way a snail shell is part of the snail. The dam is, in a sense, an extension of the beaver itself, written into the beaver's DNA, the same way the shape of its tail or the color of its fur is written there. For years, this was a radical idea, and a hard one to test. How do you actually find the gene for a behavior? How do you prove that something as complicated as building a dam is sitting in a chromosome somewhere, waiting to be activated by the sound of running water? In 2013, a research team published a paper in the journal Nature that came astonishingly close to doing exactly that. Studying oldfield mice, the scientists identified specific regions of DNA that controlled how long and how complex the burrows of these mice would be. By crossbreeding mice from different populations, they could literally watch the burrow architecture change as the genes shuffled. The shape of the tunnel was inheritable. The presence of an escape route was inheritable. The mice were not learning these designs from each other. They were carrying the blueprints in their cells and unrolling them every time they dug. What Wilson saw in his concrete tanks suddenly had a mechanism. If a behavior as complex as dam building can be coded into the DNA of a rodent, it forces a much larger and more uncomfortable question. What else, in the animal kingdom, is being inherited that we have been crediting to learning, intelligence, or culture? The migration paths of monarch butterflies, who travel thousands of miles to a forest none of them have ever visited. The intricate woven nests of weaver birds, whose first attempt at nest building, even in total isolation, already shows the basic species-specific knot pattern. The web designs of orb-weaving spiders, identical across generations that have never met. All of these may be carrying, in some form, the same kind of genetic instructions that Wilson lit up when he turned on his tap in a Stockholm laboratory. This is why, more than 50 years after Wilson's experiments, this question has not gone away. It has gotten bigger. The Templeton Foundation has been funding research into the heritability of complex animal behavior, and documentary filmmakers, like John Downer Productions, have been quietly partnering with scientists to capture wild animals doing things that no parent ever taught them. New genetic tools, new imaging techniques, and new long-term field studies are steadily peeling back what was once dismissed as instinct, and showing that instinct itself is a far stranger and more sophisticated thing than biology used to assume. So, are beavers born knowing how to build? The honest answer is yes. They are born with something that functions like a blueprint, a set of trigger responses, and a hardwired drive to act on the sound of running water. But the deeper, harder question, the one biologists are still chasing, is how that blueprint got there in the first place. So the next time you walk past a stream and see a wall of sticks and mud holding back the water, remember that you are not just looking at a structure. You are looking at a piece of an animal's body, a blueprint that was passed from parent to child for millions of years, written in DNA, waiting for the sound of running water to wake it up. If videos like this are why you watch this channel, the subscribe button is right below. There is a lot more where this came from.